I am celebrating something this week, and it has me looking back on some things I've learned in 12 years of podcasting. And specifically in this episode, I'm going to pull together a few things that 12 years of podcasting has taught me about sales, because these were the most impactful lessons that allowed me to do the thing I'm celebrating today. Welcome to the More Profitable Podcast with Stacey Harris. I'm Stacey, and this is the spot to learn more about the strategies, tactics, and tools you need to build your more profitable podcast. My team and I work every day with podcasters like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of your sales team, because your show should be built to generate and convert leads. So let's get into it. Welcome to the show. I'm stoked to share this with you. So, as of listening to this, as of the day this goes live, this upcoming Saturday, January 25th, marks 10 years since my husband left his full-time job and came home. Initially, he worked for me and worked with me in the business, and I'll be real, that didn't last long. It lasted a couple of years before I replaced him with other people, and he really shifted into sort of the full-time husband and dad role. And this has been an incredible thing for us. It's been really, really valuable, especially in our family and the needs of our family. This has been such a gift to have, and it genuinely became possible. It was built out of this work, what I do here with this show, and the purpose this show fills in my business as a not just marketing tool, but a sales and conversion tool. And so it seemed appropriate, apropos, if you will, to celebrate by, of course, reflecting, but also sharing some of the sales lessons that this podcast has taught me. I have been doing this show since 2013. We were about a year and a half into my being self-employed. My husband was absolutely still working. I launched the show initially because, frankly, honestly, I really hated writing blog posts. I couldn't do it consistently. I just couldn't. I struggled and struggled and struggled. I set goals. I built plans. I created systems. I hired people. I invested in coaching, and I could not get a blog post written 2 months in a row. Genuinely. And I learned something I have said on this show many times. And if you've literally ever heard me say anything, you've heard this before. So stay with me. I have a much bigger filter between my brain and my fingertips than I do my brain and my mouth. And that doesn't serve me all the time. And maybe sometimes wildly does serve me. Maybe it's really important that this is why I send emails sometimes, as I was getting on the phone call. But the filter was just too big. I was constantly editing myself as I was writing, and I just really struggled with it. And I was in a mastermind, and I was lamenting about this difficulty I had in getting my content out consistently and the impact it was having on me growing my business and blah, 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 blah. And the person I was working with said, well, why don't you start a podcast? You like podcasting. Your degree is in audio engineering. You're one of the only people at the time that they knew that was listening to a lot of podcasts. And I was like, I could do that? That's allowed? And turns out it was. And so I launched the first version of this show. This show has existed since 2013, but it has been through iterations. It has rebranded twice over the years. Yeah, it originally launched as Hit the Mic. It ran as Hit the Mic until 2019. In 2019, we rebranded to Uncommonly More, because that's the name of the agency. And then in, I want to say 2022 or 2023, honest to goodness, I don't remember. I should have looked it up. We rebranded again to the More Profitable Podcast. I'll actually link in the show notes to the episode we did where we talked about that rebrand, because I do talk about I do take it way back. And so I will share that link in the show notes if you want to listen to that episode as well. Before we get into our lessons, I do want to remind you a great place to get answers to your podcasting questions, if you're struggling to use your podcast as a conversion tool right now, is over on the private podcast, the podcast newsroom. We had a new episode go up this week. In fact, we are answering an important question. We're talking about how to stay consistent in your podcast when your life gets in the way, when your business gets in the way, whatever it may be. And that's a really common question we get. It's a big part of the work we do with our clients. And so I highly recommend go check that out. Again, you can get your private feed over at thepodcastnewsroom.com. It is absolutely free. You just got to sign up for the private feed. And of course, submit your questions anytime at uncommonlymore.com/AMA. And stay tuned to that private podcast because that's where I answer them all. As I sat down to do this reflection, I was reminded of something I want to remind you of aside from these lessons, which is that we are all getting better by doing this. The number one piece of advice I give people before they launch a podcast on how to sidestep all the mistakes they could make is to just start, because you're not going to sidestep any of them. You might make them differently. You might make them in a different order. You might make your own version of them. There might be some mistakes I made that you don't make, and there might be same mistakes you make that I don't make, because we don't all make all of them, but you will make some. And the way you will learn, the way you will get better, the way your show will be impacted is by continuing to do it. This is my sincere hope, is that this is the best episode of this podcast I've ever done. And that 12 years from now, if I'm still doing this show, it's the 665th worst show. My hope is that every episode, I'm a little bit better than I was last time. And so if you see yourself in any of the mistakes I shared today, I want to invite you to take that as a call to action instead of a judgment. I want you to take this as a sign that now is the time for you to be ready to do something differently, to evolve past the issue that you see. And instead of judging what's been, try to make what's next better. Try to move in the direction of what you want to be doing instead of wallowing in, most frankly, self-deprecation of what has been. All right? I needed that to be there, because I see a lot of time when people, and I see this in myself. And so maybe that's how we position this. Maybe this is how I just own this. Like, I'm absolutely guilty, and you can ask any coach I've ever worked with. I'm absolutely of being the person who sees the 3 mistakes you make doing XYZ post on social media or the podcast episode or the email or whatever. And I go, you're right, I am making that mistake. Now wonder I'm a failure. No wonder I suck at everything. And I make that mean so much. And it doesn't need to mean that much. And I can tell you that, and you can logically know that. And still, it will take intentional action for you to use this information as a way to get better instead of a way to judge yourself and critique yourself and make yourself feel like you've not done enough, because you've been doing a great job. Even if you are making or have made one or all of the mistakes I'm going to talk about today, just take it as a call to action to reflect, to catch yourself in that more often and more quickly, and start to make the shift. All right? This doesn't mean that you can't do it. This doesn't mean that you're doing a bad job. It just means that it's time to evolve to something else. All right? I've got to say it. I have to say it. It drives me crazy, because it's so easy, especially for those of us who are running one woman shops or very small teams. We put so much weight on ourselves. We put so much responsibility on ourselves, because there's a lot of weight and there's a lot of responsibility, especially, if this feels relevant, especially in this episode where we're sort of celebrating the accomplishment of sort of having my husband home and as part of this family exclusively, and not having to work outside of the house for the last 10 years, especially if you're somebody who is the sole provider, the sole income provider for your family. It's a lot of weight. And when we hear these lessons, we beat ourselves up. And that's not productive. That's not going to move us forward. And it is more important for us than maybe anybody else. that we learn to move through the judgment and into action quickly. And so I had to put that caveat in there because I know that feeling so well. It's something I have dealt with. It's something I deal with in working with our clients. It's something I deal with in talking to my friends who are also in this space, either as coaches or mentors or consultants or service providers or whatever it is that they do. This is something we check ourselves on a lot. And so I wanted to check you on this before we dig into our lessons. With that, I'm not going to say lesson another time without starting to share some. So let's dig in to the first thing I have learned about sales in 12 years of podcasting. And that's that it has nothing to do with what they want to hear. The content that will convert, the content that will have an impact for not only you, but for your listener is the thing they need to hear. I so often see people hopping into Instagram or Threads or whatever other social platform. They're even surveying their email list, asking on podcasts, hey, tell me what you want to hear. What do you want to hear more of? What questions can I answer for you? And frankly, it's not about what they want to hear. Because in most cases, for those of us, especially in the coaching and service space, we know more than they do about their problem. It's not because they're dumb. It's not because they don't know. It's because you and I know more about the solution and therefore have more insights in how the problem manifests. We learned that in learning how to solve whatever problem that they have. And so I see a lot. The biggest example of this is in the marketing space, frankly. Everybody and everybody they've ever talked to has the same problem. They don't have enough leads. It's a marketing problem. However, oftentimes when I or the people who I talk to who are, the other folks in the marketing space, we talk a lot about the fact that we'll get into conversation with some of these people and go, you have plenty of leads. You're not converting anyone. And the problem really comes down to them not understanding what a lead is, them not understanding where their leads are coming from, and them not having things in place to see when a lead raises their hand and identifies themselves. And so it becomes much more about solving those problems than actually getting more leads. It's really just about adjusting the spotlight so you actually see where they are. An extension of that is you may know where those leads are. You may see them raising their hand, but they're not converting. And it's easy for us to go, well, the marketing's not working. They're not converting. Well, that's not a marketing problem. That's a sales problem. Sales skills are going to come into place. And the good news is when you improve your sales skills, you improve your marketing skills. But so often we don't see people coming and saying, hey, I have a sales problem I can't convert. They're saying, hey, I have a marketing problem. I have a lead problem. Not enough people are seeing me. I have a visibility problem. I don't have enough Instagram followers. I don't have enough people downloading my podcast. Well, I'm actually seeing your podcast numbers tick up month after month. I'm seeing good, solid retention in your listenership. You actually have a content conversion problem. You've not sent them someplace to be. You've not given them a next step in this podcast. You're attracting these listeners. You're getting this visibility, but you're not telling them where to go to hire you. In some cases, you're not even telling them that they could hire you. And so when we poll our audience and say, hey, what do you want me to talk about? What do you want to hear? We're going to be talking to what they think the problem is and not actually helping them see what the problem is. And by extension, not helping them see what the actual solution is. And that's the game changer, is being able to position the problem that they don't really understand with the solution they didn't realize was possible. And that sounds really like grandiose and like huge and like this like momentous thing. But honestly, it's often about like just giving them a hair more clarity. It's just helping give them a hair more perspective. Because this really can be an inside the jar problem. I think I'm assuming you've also heard this cliche of like, you can't see the label from inside the jar. We're all inside the jar of our own problems. We're all inside the jar of our own businesses. And it's really hard to read that label. And so when we bring somebody else in and we say, hey, help us see the outside of this jar, help me read that label. I want your podcast to be the tool helping them read the label. This is not about saying, here's the 97 steps it's going to take to solve your problems. Go for it. It's about saying, hey, here's what the label says. With that information, here's more of what might be an actual solution. Here's the actual thing that's going to solve your problem, which we now know because we can read that label. Because we now have that perspective to see where the gaps might be between your current problem and your desired result. And that gap between there, that's your solution. And so when we are fixated on what do they want to hear, and this, I have been in so many group programs and high level, I'm talking high level masterminds where I am hearing women say, I just don't know what they want me to tell them. It is not about what they want you to tell them. I don't care at all what they want to hear. I care about what they need to hear. And the person who knows that is not them, it's you. And if you can't get there, if you can't see that yet, that's the inside of your jar. That means you need someone like me to help you read that label. So how about you and I sit down, we'll read the label, and then we'll build our next steps. That is a symptom of you being so inside of your jar, you cannot help them see the outside of their jar. It's got to be about what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. So please, stop surveying them. It's not giving you good data. The second sales lesson, and this one might hurt. Comparison doesn't steal joy. It steals progress. And more importantly, sales. The times in which my podcast was the least effective, the times in which my sales were the poorest in my business, are the times where I was spending the bulk of my time and the biggest amount of my energy in trying to reverse engineer what it looked like someone else might be doing. Yep, sit with that. Just, I know you've been there too. We all have, where we're so fixated on what it looks like someone else is getting, doing, achieving, whatever, that we take our eyes off the direction we're moving in. And more often than not, what I find this does is pull you out of what it is you're trying to get to. Because one, we don't actually know what's going on over there. We don't actually know what's happening behind the scenes, what's involved, what success may or may not be there. And yet, we put our heads down and we full speed start running in a direction that we've decided someone else might also be running in, instead of putting our head down and focusing on our trip. A big sign for me when I was in this place that I had gone too far down the road was that you could no longer tell from my podcast what it is I talked about. This was a lesson I absolutely learned early in the podcast, and I was at the time still having a lot of guests because the shows I looked up to, the hosts I looked up to, had a lot of guests. And so I would start booking the guests that appeared on shows I looked up to and having conversations with people on my show that other hosts that I looked up to had on their show. And I got further and further and further away from my message and my purpose with my podcast. But most importantly, I got further and further and further and further away from being able to use this show for the job this show is been hired to do, right? This is sales and marketing. This is a tool for you and I to connect, for you to get to know me better, for you to get to know what I do better, for you to get to know the work that I do and the way we approach it. That's what this show is for. And when I run around trying to do versions of episodes that I have seen on other shows, or or position myself in the way I've seen someone I look up to position themselves as, I get further and further away from who I am, my unique perspective, the value of my experience, and the impact of doing my work my way. And that is so detrimental, not just to your joy, but to your progress, to your growth as an expert, and to your sales. Because why would you be building trust with someone who doesn't trust themselves enough to follow their path, to make decisions from their own expertise, with their own goals in mind, with their own audience in mind, with their own expertise in mind? Why would you hire that person? Why would you trust that person? You wouldn't. And so I'm not building a show that builds trust if I'm building a show that chases someone else's goals and outcomes, that is built to just replicate something I think might work. And this is a big one. This is one that sneaks up on you. This is a hard one to admit. This is one that I learned really early in podcasting, and thank goodness I've not had to learn lots of times in my podcast. But this is the one of these 3 lessons that we're going to talk about today that I most catch myself still making in other parts of my business. We revamped our onboarding last year, and when I sat down to look at the tools we were using and the messaging that was in them, I had just been through onboarding with someone else. And I really liked their onboarding. And I was like, it's so fun and it's so cool and it's so like them. But they're very different than me. They don't do the same things. They don't offer the same things. Their personality is different. That's why I hired them, because I wanted that outside perspective. And so as I was looking through my onboarding, I had to really catch myself and not try to chase this new direction. And because I was so cognizant of it, because I have learned this lesson, as I reviewed my old onboarding, there was so much of it that I could see was trying to sound like someone else. Trying, and not even anyone in particular, just sort of the mythical, imaginary conglomeration of 6 people that I thought would be me. And it's like, no, this is not, it's not. And so when I sat down to write the emails, I was like, I'm going to write these emails. I'm going to just give them the information they need. And it's going to sound like every other freaking email from me, because I wrote those ones too. I wasn't trying to chase someone else. So this is absolutely one of those ones that I catch myself in weird spots still. Social media, I think, is the other one that this is really easy for me to fall into. Uh, I'm watching the social media expert or TikTok talking head of the time, and I'm like, oh, they're great. I like this and this and this and this. And then I'll go to record something and I'll be like, or I'll go to write something and I'll be like, this this sounds familiar, but not like me. And I will have to check in and make sure that I am being in alignment with who I am, that I am being inspired, maybe, by things I see and things I like, because we all are. Absolutely. We're absolutely always lifting things from people we like and people we respect. But I have to be lifting a tactic and putting it in my strategy and not trying to replicate someone else's strategy by taking in their amalgamation of tactics and filling in the gaps with made up misbelief and calling it a day. That can't be the way you run your show. It's got to be about doing your show. It's got to be about talking to your audience. It's got to be about living in your expertise. That's what generates money. That's what builds trust. That's what converts sales. The third piece I want to touch on is ego and fear. Ego and fear are what is holding you back from using your podcast as a sales tool, but it doesn't look like what you think it looks like. We often think of ego and fear being full on ego of like, I know everything and I can't be told anything and I'm the smartest person in the room. But that's not always what ego looks like. And fear, we so often think about like that, well, it's put me in freeze. I'm not doing anything because I'm too afraid to. But that's not how ego and fear are actually tripping you up. The way ego most frequently manifests for the podcasters who I work with, and how it has most frequently manifested for me, is in doing things like over-explaining. Avoiding saying the thing that the listener really needs to hear because it feels too confrontational to them. And or prioritizing looking smart over being relatable. And that last one is something I've had to work through with this episode, like in doing this one, because it feels way too about me. I don't love when this is way too about me. It's uncomfortable. I just want to tell you this is what you should do because it's a good idea. But in the context of what I'm sharing, in understanding that I make these mistakes too, that these mistakes are hard-earned lessons, that these are just removing yourself from the pedestal, right? Saying, I'm not the perfect shiny expert who always gets it right. I'm a human. Our ego does not love that. It just doesn't. And so it manifests itself as over-explaining, over-complicating, over-jargoning, in prioritizing, look how smart I am, instead of look how human I am. But the episodes that have impact, the episodes that get you DMs, that get you emails, that get you clients, position you as an expert human. Meaning, yes, you know stuff. You are an absolutely unquestionable smarty pants. And you probably earned that. You have put in the work to get there. And that work is learning and education and training and experience, but it is also screwing stuff up. And when you can be honest about that, you connect in a whole other way. Does this mean airing every bit of dirty laundry you've ever done? No. Does this mean small doses so as not to overwhelm our nervous systems? Absolutely. But if you can put the ego and the fear that someone might figure you out away and connect and share your lessons and share your experience and share your hard-earned expertise, that's where that sales success is going to be. That's where that connection is going to be. That's where you get people who listen to your show for years. I have people who have been listening to this show since it was still called Hit the Mic Marketing. They're some of the coolest people on the whole planet. It's fantastic. And even if you're somebody who is on episode 3 of listening to me, I want you to know that I'm human. I don't want just the people who found me 12 years ago or 8 years ago or 6 years ago or 3 years ago to know that I'm human because they saw me screw this stuff up. No, I want you to know I'm human too. Because guess what? You're probably also going to notice that I'm screwing things up now. Because I remain human, as do you. And so don't let your ego force you into over-teaching, overwhelming, over-explaining. Instead, own your story, own your experience, and share it. Because it's how your listener, your lead, your potential client sees themselves in your experience and knows that if you can do it, you can help them do it too. And that's what works. That's what connects. That's what moves people into action, is when they can remove you from the pedestal and stop with this like, oh, well, of course Stacy can do it. She's been doing it forever. No, I've been doing it forever, which has now taught me that I definitely did stuff wrong. And here's how we do it instead. And then I start doing it that way. And then I see that that works. And then I share that with you. That's what this is. That's what all of us are doing. All right. Before we wrap up, we've talked today about talking about what they need to hear, We've talked about comparison. We've talked about ego. That's a lot of mindset stuff. The last thing I want to leave you with, sort of as like a little bonus one, because I think this is like maybe the biggest sort of bumper sticker version of this. And so I just wanted to hit it briefly. If I'm confused, they're confused. If you're confused, your listener is too. If I'm confused when I'm telling you about an offer, about whether it's valuable, about how I'm structuring it, about what you're going to get out of it, about any of it, so will you. You will also be confused, and a confused mind says no. And so, as you're going to implement any of the things we talked about today, as you're reflecting and seeing any shifts you want to make, I want you to be really clear that you're doing so with as little confusion as possible. Don't just start throwing noodles at the wall and hoping something sticks and the spaghetti's done. No. Instead, be making these incremental 1% shifts so that these changes that you make, these evolutions that you take on, aren't confusing you and aren't confusing your listeners, but instead are just you modeling your own growth and evolution. And if ever you're listening to something you've created, you are watching a video you filmed, you are editing social, whatever, any bit of content, you're sending a sales email, you're sending a follow-up to a contract or proposal you've sent, just make sure it's not confusing. Make it stupid simple. Because if you're confused about any bit of it, they'll be confused too. This is something that I can't say enough. And I couldn't put this conversation down without sharing. Because I think it manifests itself a lot in content, in podcasting specifically, where I'm like, I'm not really sure how I'm going to do this. I'm not really sure how I'm going to get to the point, but I'll get there. No, you're creating confusion. And so you've got to come in clear. And again, that clarity may come from getting outside of your jar. And so if sitting down with somebody and getting outside of your jar allows you to create clarity, that is a gift to your listener. A great way to get outside of your jar and create that clarity, sit down with me for a podcast strategy intensives. We've got spots opened up for the next couple of months. Head on over to uncommonlymore.com/intensive to learn more about what happens inside a podcast strategy intensive and see upcoming availability. And best of all, get yours booked. I cannot wait to sit down with you. Again, uncommonlymore.com/intensive is the place to get booked. Thank you for 12 incredible years of this show. I'm sure we'll talk more about this year. But this last 10 years, celebrating this now, the impact of these lessons on not just this podcast and making it an effective sales tool, but in every part of my sales has been so valuable, and I'm so grateful for it. And I hope that my mistakes and my lessons can help you shortcut some of your own. All right? I'll see you right back here next week. Bye. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember that content consumption does not make changes. So commit to doing something from today's episode. Maybe it's taking action on what we talked about. Maybe it's reaching out to me and learning more about podcast strategy intensives or what podcast production looks like with our team. All of that is over at uncommonlymore.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the podcast newsroom, I want to remind you that is a great next step. If you're not really sure what comes next, hang out over there. Get those exclusive private episodes. That's over at podcastnewsroom.com. And the last favor I will ask, because social proof is endlessly important for sure, is to leave a rating or review for the show. If you go to ratethispodcast.com/more, that's the easiest way to do it. But I would love to hear what you thought of the show, what you think of the show, and if the show has been helpful for you. I can't wait to chat with you. So this is just the start of the conversation. Reach out so we can keep it going. Talk soon.